everybody, and welcome to another new episode of Office Hours. I am your host and Game Master advice giver, Adam Coble. That's me. Hello. Hi, everybody. This is episode number 62, and this is Office Hours. And if number 62 is episode number 1 for you, if you've never watched an episode of Office Hours before, here's what you can expect. 3 questions. I'm going to be answering them. People on the internet, maybe you, yes, you, maybe you submitted those questions. So some folks have gone to my website at www.adam-coble.com, and they've submitted questions through the Office Hours link, recorded their lovely voice, or recorded someone else's voice, or had a robot do it, and they've asked questions about game design and game mastering and tabletop role-playing games, and also about their relationships with their players, with their game master, and with other people in that vicinity. I haven't had anybody ask me about their relationship with a game designer or with their friendly local game store, but either one is fine. So my goal for this show is to answer specific questions, to give specific advice, because I think that we are awash in general game master advice. I think that there's so much already out there, both in books, on Twitter, on websites and blogs. And I want to give you advice that is specific to your questions, which means that some of these questions will have information that has nothing to do with your group at all. You'll be like, this has never happened to me. This never will happen to me. I don't know or care about this. And that's okay. You should listen anyway, because it might come up later. Specificity is the watchword of the day. So let's get started. Let's get started with our first question. Today's first question comes to us from Thomas.
Hey Adam, I'm making my own game kind of right now, and my question is, how do I make my system about something mechanically? So how do I put the topic of the game into the mechanics? I don't just want to reskin any existing system and just put a new world on top of it, but I don't know where to start really, so maybe you could give us some examples of the thought process of how to create some mechanics that are thematic, basically, maybe by giving us examples from what you thought about mechanics you put into Dungeon World. Thanks a lot.
Well, don't thank me yet, Thomas. You can thank me at the end of the question. No, you can't. This is pre-recorded. So, when one refers to a game's mechanisms being about something, I usually assume they mean that in the sense of referring to Jared Sorensen's second question that asks, how is your game about that, as a follow-up to what is your game about? The question itself is intended to shed light on the nature of mechanisms as a fiction-influencing engine, and in fact, the core means that any game designer has to influence the behavior of players. Now, this is true for all sorts of games, not just tabletop RPGs, right? The rules of a game, or its mechanisms, tell us what that game cares about, and, by extension, what the game's designers care about. For example, are you ready? We're gonna sports metaphor. Are you ready for a sports metaphor? All right. So, for example, in basketball, the game cares slightly more about the shooting skill of the player than it does about the dunking skills of the player. And it illustrates this by giving more points, which is to say the intrinsic reward of basketball, to players who shoot from further away from the hoop. Basketball also cares, for example, about maintaining player momentum and ball possession instability, and creates these states by way of the rule that prevents traveling. These are things that contribute to what basketball is about from a design perspective. To use a slightly closer to home example, Dungeons & Dragons is about combat, at least in significant part, because not only is the reward structure predominantly built around it, right, vis-a-vis Jared's third question, how are the players rewarded for that behavior, but the mechanisms for player agency focus nearly entirely on combat. the granularity of the combat rules being more significant than any other element of the game. There are two reasons in a game that you would have a lot of rules for a thing, right? Either the stakes are very high, or the systems model a very complex thing in an ornate way. Both of these are also good ways to tell what a game is about. The stakes of resolution of a mechanism, what's on the line when that mechanism is in play, can tell us what matters to the fiction of the game. Okay, so let me give you another example. So imagine a game where firing a gun at someone didn't really mean anything. You can't kill someone with it. You can't even really hurt them. There just aren't rules for it in the game. In that same game, saying something mean to a person might have 12 pages of detailed, granular rules with many different ways to say mean things and how you deal with the emotional fallout of that interaction, with several ways to affect characterization, continued agency, and player reward. Would you say that this game is likely to be more about conversation or about shooting? Additionally, games that strive to create a system in which all conflict has mechanical equity in the game, they tend to feel like they're not really about anything, right? Fate, as a system, is particularly this way. If you're familiar with Fate from Evil Hat, its conflict mechanisms and the attributes and abilities that power the game are so inherently modular that you could, in theory, have a Fate game that is mechanically identical to the core rules, but instead of pitting, say, your burglary against my notice skill, we're simply pitting skill A against skill B. If we did that, our fictional disconnection would be pretty extreme, but the mechanisms of the game would not change. Not to go on too much of a tangent, but I think this is what makes 4th edition D&D feel unpalatable to some people. That the poetry layer on character agency affecting abilities is so narrow that Fireball and Whirling Strike feel too similar to create mechanically incentivized variants of the same fiction, right? RoboCop and Terminator are different in more ways than just an Austrian accent. Games like Torchbearer, with a semi-generic conflict framework, tend to combat this kind of genericization of the narrative by creating detailed mechanical nuance that varies depending on the fiction. Torchbearer, and by backward extension Mouse Guard, is a mechanisms first game, right? We choose abilities, we roll dice, and then we look at the results to understand the emergent fiction before we move on. A feint is a feint is a feint, but you describe the outcome differently and parse the dice pools depending on differing fictional states. So what I mean to say here is that if we look at a game's mechanisms and we see where they plug in to the reward structure first, we can sort of get an understanding of the game's desires. This is the most obvious way to make a game about something. Dungeon World is about adventurers with changing relationships, because in it, you're rewarded for rewriting your bonds. Dungeon World is about overcoming monsters in battle, getting loot, and learning things about the world, because that's where you get end of session XP. Dungeon World is about folks who learn from their fuck-ups because you get XP for failing. Dungeon World is also about people whose moral and ethical values matter to them personally, and by denying those values and the attached actions, because they change their alignments only by acting on it, and then subsequently rejecting the award in lieu of change. So in Dungeon World, for example, if you are good and want to become evil, you must perform a good act and reject the reward the game wants to give you. The reward structure in a role-playing game is what we as designers pummel and admonish and cajole players with. More subtly, look at what gives the players agency and power in a game. Power to change the narrative in ways that are reliable and consistent. This is the how that pairs up with the why of a reward system. So, in a game, you earn XP when you do what the game wants you to do. In Dungeon World, how is it that you are empowered to explore the world, defeat foes, and obtain treasure? By using your basic, class, and special moves to overcome challenges presented by the GM's moves. Powered by the Apocalypse games empower the players, particularly, with certainty. Not the certainty of success, though stats can help with that, but the certainty of assumed outcomes. Right? For example, there are basic moves for killing someone with a close quarters weapon, killing someone with a long distance weapon, protecting someone from being killed, protecting something from being damaged, remembering something about the world you inhabit, though memory here is fictional until it's created. The character remembers, the GM creates. Noticing something about the world around you, manipulating NPCs, or helping or screwing over your friends, and for ignoring clear and present danger so that you can do all of that shit. Those are things that every player in a Dungeon World campaign can engage in, and whether they feel confident in their success or not, they can be assured that they will know, because of the way the game works, exactly what might await them on any given move. These are the things that the game is about. The game's also about the special and class moves in specific circumstances. The game is also about vast swaths of uncertainty. Like, for example, when you say to the GM in Dungeon World, I want to convince another PC to do what I say. There's no move for that. The game doesn't care about that. This isn't a game of convincing other PCs to do what you want them to do. That's not what this game is about. Dungeon World doesn't care how or if you're able to resolve that conflict, and in fact, empowers the GM to do anything they want within the boundaries of their agenda and principle when you try to do something like that. When you say something like, I want to convince them to do what I want. When you say, I scream at him to give me the ring, this is you looking to the GM to see what happens. Now, the GM will probably ask the player you're shrieking at, what do you do when they say this? Technically, it's just as allowed in the rules of Dungeon World to say, a rock falls on your head and you take 1d6 damage. Because you've engaged in the mechanisms of play. You've said, I shriek at Throndir, give me the ring. The GM looks at Throndir. Throndir's not paying attention. The GM can say, cool, you're shouting, shakes loose some stalactites from the cave roof above you, and they fall and bonk you on the head. That is completely legal Dungeon World play, because Dungeon World has turned over the authority to the GM to make a move, as hard or soft as they like, because there's no move for the player. The player has no certainty. The game does not care about player agency in that kind of situation. Everything the mechanisms of the game says is possible in the fiction is a flag to the people playing that game to tell them what the game is about. In Burning Wheel, for example, we've come to learn that there is no skill or power, at least given to mundane characters, to figure out what someone is thinking. To do that, you have to use deep, hidden magic. And even then, it's mostly vague auras. By contrast, in Apocalypse World, literally any PC can, with a decent assumption of success, know exactly what someone is thinking at any given time. This is a huge fundamental difference because it creates fiction, which, on the one hand, in Burning Wheel, everyone is a fucking enigma that we must observe through behavior to learn about. And on the other, every character is an open diary with a readme sign pointed at it. Mechanisms flag what we do and do not care about being specific enough to craft rules for as designers. In Moldvay D&D, there are rules for exploring and rules for combat. There are rules for magic and treasure. There are rules for first encounter reactions, and for just about every other goddamn thing in the entire universe, the rule is pick a number and have them roll a d6. In Moldvay, as written, a player character has about a 1 in 6 chance, at least, of accomplishing just about anything. This game cares only specifically about the things that make up its 68 pages, and for everything else, the designers have shrugged and said, make it up. This isn't laziness. This isn't apathy about creating rules. It's just we have to assume that players will desire mechanisms for things as they wander around the ludographical space our game has created for them. So we make frameworks that focus on what's important. We create rules that reward specific kinds of play, and we hope that the connection between game text, game art, layout, and the other ephemera that reinforces this is a game about X will be enough that they don't attempt to immediately play a game about Y using our games. This is why the golden rule is so personally malignant to me. As it says to a player, we think so little of our intentions that we expect you will ignore them wholesale in favor of your own in-the-moment whims, which is fine and expected because no game is reliably played precisely as written, nor should it be. Hitting the table means synthesis with actual play, but to outright expect that your players will just deviate immediately from your game to the point where you have to call it out on the first page, why even design? So, how do we make mechanisms that mean something? You want to convey a certain type of fiction into play. You want stories about close-knit, post-apocalyptic communities struggling against scarcity, or you want pulpy adventure that could fit into any genre, or you want a game about people whose moral compass is broken, but their ambitions run wild. I can't tell you how to write those mechanisms. I mean, that's your game. If I could tell you how to make that game, it would be my game and not yours. What I can say is look to what you encourage, look to what you enforce, and look to what you reward. What does your game explicitly tell me is possible? What outcomes are expected? And what will happen when I perform behavior in the framework of your game? And honestly, the best thing that any designer can do is just play the hell out of a million games. Find games, do one-shots, GM, player, I don't care. Just play games. Play so many games. And as you do, look at them critically, right? Look at what they promise in the text. Look at the art and how it matches or doesn't match. Look at your fiction that gets created at the table. Make notes. If you play a game in good faith more than once, you're going to see developments of patterns. I want to tell you about the game that, for me, really called this out. A game that imparted its narrative through its mechanisms in a really magical way. I'm going to tell you about Night Witches. Night Witches is a game by Jason Morningstar set in World War II where you play members of the all-woman Soviet bomber squadron. Okay? Because it's a Jason Morningstar game, just niche as fuck. You can wonder to yourself, great, but what kind of fiction emerges from that? How, like, are we pulpy, Nazi punching, bikini wearing Ruskies? What is this game about? We know the setting, but we don't know what the game is about. In the same way that Dogs in the Vineyard, it's easy to say the setting, right? Fictional Wild West, you play biblical paladins wandering from town to town, right? Setting. But what is the game about? Night Witches is a brilliant design Every game that I played of it felt deeply but subtly similar. Different groups, campaigns, one-shots. I could feel the themes of the game slowly bleeding through to our fiction without any specific effort on the part of the players. The gay drama, the terror of the secret police, the desperation, the sadness, the blood, and the struggle emerged on their own because of the mechanics, like the statue of David emerging from Michelangelo's block of marble, as though it were just waiting there in the rules to reveal itself. That experience with Night Witches, for me, illustrates a fundamental truth about game design. A good role-playing game will reveal itself to us as we play, sometimes subtly, sometimes overtly, but it will do so without remorse. And if we struggle against it, we're going to feel that kickback until we find ourselves, like you, Thomas, designing our own game to illustrate the fiction that we care about. Now, I know I haven't answered your question. I know that I have not told you how to be a game designer. That must be learned through experience. So play games, think about what I've said in this question, this sequence, and ask yourself, how do other games do this? You'll learn by process. Games illustrate their intended narrative primarily through mechanisms, and by playing more of them, you will learn precisely how that is done for you. But in the same way, you're going to learn that no game will do it exactly the same way that yours does, which I think is part of the excitement of design. Doing things your own way. Otherwise, why not just play Dungeons and Dragons? So our second question is more of a game master question. And what's interesting is that I'm going to address almost exclusively the target of this question, not the asker thereof. Our second question comes to us from Yeren, and I'm going to let them answer.
Hi Adam, I'm Ewan, hello, and I'm a GM from New Zealand. I've been running various one-shots of new systems every fortnight for the past few months, and I've run into a bit of a character theming problem with one of my players. He comes up with great ideas for characters because he enjoys turning narrative ideas on their heads, but you can often change the entire play of the game or gain gameplay advantage through narrative positioning, or by defining the rules of the world based on this character's backstory and inspiration. For example, a fake character inspired by anime shonen duels, therefore no one else can participate in his hardcore shonen duel, or a dread character who's a robot and then isn't threatened by the things that affect other characters. While his ideas are fun in theory, it can often mean other players being pushed out of the way to make space for this character's ideas, and I don't want to stop him coming up with interesting ideas, but I don't know how to let him have his fun thing, while still allowing for everyone else who is participating in the common theme of the game. How do I navigate this minefield? Chirpo.
This player of yours needs to be told to calm the fuck down. So I'm gonna do it. Hey, Uran's player, your GM and your group are too nice and they're too excited by your energy and your desire to be a big part of the game to say this, but I don't know you, so I can say what they probably should. Chill your shit, friend. Your excitement and need to be unique and interesting, not only unique and interesting, the most unique and interesting thing in the game, is harshing everybody else's buzz. I get you're not trying to be a buzzkill, and you are probably thinking you're bringing a big energy to the table and just, trying to make sure that the game is fun. But you need to check yourself, hombre, because the thing that you're doing here, making yourself unique and interesting, that's not wrong, right? It's the exclusionary stuff. It's the stuff that makes the whole game have to bow to your seemingly utter threat of the spotlight. That shit needs to go. Now, your friends and co-players are probably too nice to say anything, but what's happening here is that your metaphorical fly is down and there's proverbial spinach stuck in your teeth, and like everybody is just too polite to say so, but I'm not, so cut it the fuck out. The next time you have a thought to make a character that is so super unique and cool, I want you to stop and say to yourself, in what ways does this character boost the other players, offering them opportunities to shine as well? I want you to think back to the conversations you've had with your dear game master about the game's premise, about what the group hopes to accomplish. Is your concept in line with that, or are you trying to bend the game to your own whims? Did your game master say, we're going to be playing a game about pulpy, two-fisted crime fighters, and you're like, I would like to play Dracula? Stow that shit. Be a team player, but maintain that energy because that shit is good. Enthusiasm and creativity are great, but role-playing games are not about being a soloist, right? You're in a band, a deeply collaborative one. Motherfucker, you are in an orchestra, and you are all responsible for forming an interesting, cohesive, narrative operation. Now, I'm not saying you can't have tension. I'm not saying you can't have competition or outright knockdown PvP action in your game. If that is a part of the agreed concept of the game and everyone is on board, it's fine to have your niche and be special. But do not use your character to hijack the game. Especially, do not take advantage of how nice your fellow players are in not telling you to fucking quit it. Do not continue this bad behavior. Now, you may not realize that you're doing it. You may be like, but Adam, isn't it fun for everyone if I get to play Dracula? Isn't that fantastic? Isn't that a great idea? I don't know. That's probably not what you actually sound like. Let me help you. Let me help you understand if you are or are not messing this up. So, when you are working with the other players, because you do character creation as a group, right? Right, Aaron? Right? That's what they do. So when you're working with the other players to make a character, instead of coming up with your concept first and then dragging everyone else along with it, wait. Instead of, hey everybody, I'm going to be Dracula. In what ways are you orthogonal to my Dracula-ness? Are you also are you a sub-Dracula? Oh, you're a vampire hunter. Okay. Be patient. Read the rules. Think about potential, but don't make any decisions. Stay quiet. Listen to your fellow players. Actively seek out the stuff you hear them getting excited about. Learn to read their vibe. Can you see the characters that they're forming in their head? Ask questions and find out what they're feeling and thinking. Start to have a conversation about what they're interested in and talk about what you want to do, but make sure that you're giving it context based on what you've learned. Look for opportunities to partner up with another character. Look for synergy. Look for opportunities to connect your characters as they form. I was having this conversation with Zeke recently about the introduction of Kalimat and Salihafa into Court of Swords. They made their characters together, right? They knew each other. They had an existing relationship. Dungeons & Dragons doesn't have any kind of bonding rule that would have encouraged this, but it's good play because it's made both of their characters interesting. You want to make this process organic, right? Feed off each other's energy and creativity. This shit requires patience and restraint. So instead of immediately arriving at character creation, taking off your coat and screaming, I want this game to be about robots, just fucking cool it on the idea barrage and see what comes up. If there's room for this game to be about robots, this game will be about robots. I'm not saying be wishy-washy or make a character that someone else wants you to play. I'm saying temper your desire to be the special motivator of the whole game with some very serious listening and attend to the group's thoughts and wants. You're going to find that in the end, it's more fun to be on a cruise ship together than to be the solitary speedboat dragging your 4 drowning friends on a rope behind you. Okay? Okay, Yearn's player? Get your fucking shit together. Being a game master will make you better at this, because one thing that you learn as a game master is you learn to be disappointed. Now, I don't mean that in a, I mean, maybe I mean it in a negative way a little bit. You learn to be disappointed, which means you come to the table with an idea about what you want the campaign to be about. You come to the table and you're like, I want this game to be about backstabbing and intrigue, and you tell your players that, and they build their characters, and maybe the first few sessions as they get their feet under them is about backstabbing and intrigue, but the game will drift away from what you thought you wanted, right? You will find that you become disappointed in the sense that if you are too attached to your core concept, the game will get away from you. As a GM, you realize you can't do that. You cannot attach yourself to that. You have to let the game go where it is and grow, and the best you can do is grow along with it. Had I started Mirror Shades thinking, I am very invested in this being a traditional game about Shadowrun stuff, I would have been crying into my synth beer 4 episodes in as the players were like, yeah, you know what though? Dating sim. But instead, what I did was I grew with the game. I let Mirror Shades change what I wanted. As a player, we create a character not to answer a question, right? I mean, literally, the question that we're answering is, what is your character? But we posit to the fictional universe, I wonder about this person. What will they be like? What will this still abstract character crystallize and become? That's much more interesting. Don't let your character be a firm statement. And don't make that statement so loud you can't hear anybody else. So, Yearn, you still there? Okay. All right, buddy, friend, pal. You and your group need to stop being so bashful. I get that you're scared of trampling this little flower and you don't want to have them pout and sulk and walk away from your game, and stop bringing that cool creative energy, because that shit is good, right? But it's your responsibility to stop being so fucking bashful and talk to this person about your feelings. It sounds to me like they're seriously making your game less fun than they deserve to be, and I don't know if they know it. I think that it's probable their heart is in the right place. It doesn't sound like they're trying to drizz the word in your game or whatever by being the special, super cool Sam Hate style bullshit character. I don't think that's what they're doing on purpose. If you haven't just already shown them this episode, hi. Because maybe that would be too aggressive or rude or whatever, fine. But you need to do something about this if you're going to keep playing with this person. It sounds like they're coming to the table with a ton of creative juice, and they just really want everyone to just drink it all by the gallon. Only, juice metaphor. Can I do this in a way that isn't gross? Never mind. They're just trying really hard, and they're sucking up all the air in the room. There you go. That's a good metaphor. Sucking up all the air. So when you go to put your campaign together next time, and everyone says yes to robot pilots dealing with teenage angst, and they say to you, I want to be a half dragon from another dimension, and I'm being chased by dimension hopping silicon mummies who want to destroy me and everything I love. You need to learn to say, no. No, player. I'm tempted to encourage you to say, no, fuck you. But instead, let's learn to say no, but. You're going to hear a lot of people who like improv telling you that the best possible thing you can do as a GM is say yes and. But yes and is horseshit. Because games aren't improv. Games give the GM specific agendas to follow and specific authority over those agendas. And one of those is a cohesive campaign structure. So unless the game you're playing specifically says otherwise, it's on you to say, hey, buddy, this isn't a half-dragon kind of game. The reason we don't just leave it there is because, no, fuck you is a real good way to kill a player's joy and energy. You don't want to be like, no, that's dumb, shut up. Instead, saying, no, but can allow you to get at what this overeager human is trying to accomplish, which is probably spicing up the game with a character that they find fun to play. No, but is a firm way of saying this idea currently doesn't fit, but what do you like about it and how can we work around it? You might say to them, no, you can't play a half dragon, but maybe you'd like to play the only alien at overwrought Christian metaphor for the Garden of Eden Mecha Academy. That might work. And then you could say, oh, you want to have a dark past where your species was wiped out and you're being hunted? Sure, that's fine, but the game is not about that. We're not going to have that be the core of the narrative. You can be that dude, and we can threaten your past coming out, but the game is explicitly not going to be about your character's revenge crusade against the Deesnutsians. Right? Once you can get the A-OK on that, and do so with the whole group present, if the player still insists in-game on being like, I'm going to jump in the cockpit of the ISS Judas Did Nothing Wrong, and I'm blasting off for Deesnuts 4, it's vengeance! You can all sternly look at that person and say, hey, fucker, we talked about this. You said you wouldn't do this. It's okay to say no. It's okay to say, this idea as it stands doesn't fit. And while it's never okay to just shut someone's creativity down, it's okay to find better ways to work with them. You just have to work up the nerve to say no before you can get to no, but. But. Question number 3 takes a step back and takes a long look at something we've all seen in role-playing games before.
Hey Adam, this is Virascali. I wanted to ask you to talk about the philosophy of dungeon building and how it differs depending on the RPG tradition your game is using, such as Powered by the Apocalypse or OSR. What elements are always present in a dungeon, and what might differ from system to system? I guess in your mind, what makes a dungeon a dungeon? Thanks for listening.
Thanks for asking the question, Virascali. So, this is a super rad question. And I could probably, if I had time, put together an entire episode just about what am a dungeon. So I'm going to try to give you the short form version of the answer, and I'm going to suggest to you a little bit of reading that you ought to do. So, if you're interested in dungeons as a thing, I've said this over and over, just so many times. You've got to read Playing at the World. You have to. if you care about this stuff. It's written by John Peterson. It's the definitive history of early D&D, and it shows us the origins of modern role-playing games. In it, John walks us through the process of pre-D&D becoming Chainmail, fantasy tabletop war game, and Chainmail from there, by way of the work of David Wesley and Dave Arneson, innovating into Brownstein, which you may not know what that is, but you will learn if you read this. The evolution of the modern dungeon, and then this de facto locative space for adventure. It's an absolute must-read if you care about the lineage of D&D and our hobby. Now, additionally, if you want to get into the fictional and philosophical stuff behind not only dungeons in Dungeons & Dragons, but more specifically the idea of enclosed space, alternate realities where magic and weird shit happen that the normal world doesn't get to see or is safe from, you really need to read, especially discussions of the magic circle in a book called In the Dust of This Planet. It's a philosophy book by Eugene Thacker. In the Dust of This Planet, Thacker discusses the power of the dungeon as we know it in D&D, but describes it as the inverse magic circle, right? So a magic circle, as Thacker describes it, is a metaphor for keeping something safely contained, right? So it's about the other, the alien, the demonic, keeping it contained within a space. And that can be literal or figurative, and he talks all about that. But there's a subchapter that spoke to me as a game master about the inverse magic circle. The idea of being inside a bubble of reality. In the case of Dungeons & Dragons, that reference of torchlight. Submerged in an area of terror and darkness where the rules of reality no longer exist, right? This enclosed space where terrible, supernatural, horrific shit goes down. Thacker never specifically calls out D&D or whatever, but it's a fascinating book all the way through. As a D&D fan and dungeon horror philosophy nerd, I found it particularly interesting. The essays on Magic Circle inversion apply equally well to a game like Subnautica or the Nostromo from Alien, right? And then he talks about what happens when we allow the outside in, right? When the Magic Circle breaks. So when that 60-foot radius of torchlight is violated by rust monsters or magic spells or the other, right? Fascinating stuff. So playing at the world and In the Dust of This Planet they'll both be very interesting to you vis-a-vis dungeons. Now, when we get in closer to our hobby itself and its treatment of what a dungeon actually is, I went looking for some examples. Now, I looked through original D&D, like white box, brown box, whatever version of OD&D, looking for anything that actually specifically calls out what the fuck a dungeon is. If you've never read OD&D, it's pretty bad. It's not well written. It's terribly edited, if it was edited at all. It's revolutionary, but revolutionary in the way that a caveman banging flint and steel together accidentally made fire is interesting. I don't want to downplay its impact, but it's not very well written. It does not talk about what a dungeon is, which doesn't surprise me. Now, however, in 1980, basic D&D calls out the dungeon by way of this paragraph. Let me read this to you. So, Moldvay D&D, basic D&D, says, "It is the DM's job to prepare the setting for each adventure before the game begins. This setting is called a dungeon, since most adventures take place in underground caverns or stone rooms beneath old ruins or castles. Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition takes a similarly literal approach, listing the dungeon as one of many places an adventure can take place." And I quote, "An adventure features a fantastic setting, whether it's an underground dungeon, a crumbling castle, a stretch of wilderness, or a bustling city. In Dungeon World, Sage and I have this to say. As an adventurer, you'll spend a lot of time in dungeons. The word dungeon conjures up an image of the stony halls under a castle where prisoners are kept, but a dungeon is really any place filled with danger and opportunity. A dragon's cave, an enemy camp, a forgotten sewer, a sky castle, the very foundations of the world. I think that in Dungeon World, our approach to what am dungeon is probably more in line with what, say, World of Warcraft players might think of as a dungeon, right? It's a contained instance of adventure. In my mind, as a game master, when I think about a dungeon, whether it's the ruined hall of a pair of wizards or the tomb of an ancient lich, they're just examples of a larger set of what makes up a place to have an adventure. A dungeon, in my mind, contains three things. Three things to make it what it is. A dungeon is a dungeon based on its location, based on the obstacles therein, and above all, that it is contained. So this is Thacker's influence, right? This is the magic circle. A dungeon is a place to which we go. A dungeon is not everywhere. A dungeon is a place in which the rules may be broken, right? Where danger and strangeness abound, and where normal people are not often found. In a way, it's the dungeon that defines adventurers as being the other, because they are the only ones with the ability or temperament or outright madness necessary to delve into these places that no sane person would go. A dungeon is a specific place. It might be a series of caves. It might be a cursed castle. It might be a ruined town or city under siege. So long as we can look at the boundaries and borders and say, this is dungeon, this is not. Omu is a dungeon. Firefinger is a dungeon. Camp Vengeance might be a dungeon too, depending. A battlefield? Definitely a dungeon. Look at Shadowrun. An office building is a dungeon. Chult, while dangerous, not a dungeon. Port Nyanzaru, not a dungeon. Some game systems, map dungeons technically, creating detailed specificity of what inhabits each room, what treasure can be found, and where monsters roam. Some systems assign power level of the danger therein according to the level to which one deviates from reality. The further we move away from the surface world, the deadlier the enemies and the juicier the rewards. This is reflected mechanically. Monsters on level 4 have more hit points, punch harder, and guard more gold pieces than the plebs on level 1, and accordingly, we too must level with them. Our power growing as we deviate from reality. I would go so far as to say, if we want to get philosophical, a level 5 wizard is less a normal human being than a level 1 wizard. Games like DCC call this out mechanically, right? By the time you're level 10, you're barely human. If you want to see a really good example of a game that handles this stratified dungeon situation, look at the Nightmares Underneath, right? Nightmares Underneath, Johnstone's brilliant OSR game, is fantastic at this. Dungeons are narratively, fictionally the other, capital O. They are cancers on the world. Dungeons in Persona, right? Perfect example of this. And one thing that is a good threat in a role-playing game, thinking of Persona, and thinking of Stalker, in fact, is a good example of this, or Roadside Picnic, what is a good threat in a role-playing game is the incursion of dungeon into the real, right? I mean, the Area X trilogy, right? The Southern Reach trilogy is all about this. Area X is a dungeon. The Southern Reach is not a dungeon, but they are blending together in a way that terrifies. Some mechanical systems are less stringent, right? Some leave the dungeon open to interpretation or filling in as we go. I don't think that either approach, right, improvisational or pre-built, I don't think either of them necessitates the dungeonness or the non-dungeonness of those two things. You don't have to know every single detail of the dungeon before the characters enter it. A door unopened with no prep beyond can be anything at all. If a door goes unopened, was there ever a room on the other side? Or more to the point, prep doesn't make a dungeon, because if we never see it on screen, the prep is irrelevant. It frees us up. It frees us up for situations in which somebody says, GM, is there a secret door here? Because with a quick brush of the eraser, we can say, well, yes, there is, because that's a better idea than the one that we had. Something else to me, I think, that really matters about a dungeon is its place in the world, right? Its raison d'etre vis-a-vis the players. If a dungeon is just sitting there, fat with treasure, with no impetus for the players to visit, aside from that, it just doesn't feel like it has the same significance to me. All my favorite dungeons have some reason for the players to be there, above and beyond simply, we are adventurers, this is what we do. The dungeon in Temple of Elemental Evil, for example, isn't just the temple itself, or the moat house, but, as in the introductory adventure, the entire village of Hamlet is part of that dungeon in some way or another. The idea of, say, against the cult of the reptile god, the idea of the reptile god's temple as literal dungeon, but the front-like spread of the cult into the civilized spaces of the village nearby creates that nebulous, liminal dungeon, not dungeon space. To some astute players, the Keep on the Borderlands isn't the name for the base from which we inevitably pillage the Caves of Chaos, but is itself the dungeon which is inevitably pillaged, right? I've always wondered why the Keep on the Borderlands isn't instead called the Caves of Chaos. And I think this is because it's just as valid and just as viable to side with Chaos and sack that keep. It's where all the good treasure is anyway. A good dungeon has an impetus for visiting, right? The more personal, the better. Every good GM knows that tailoring the adventure to fit the characters, making the dungeon have some personal value, can prevent that wailing cry of, oh, why did we even come to this terrible place when half the party is dead and the other half have lost all their treasure? A bad dungeon is just a series of rooms, interconnected with no rhyme or reason between them. You can see this stuff clear as day in a badly designed dungeon if you look hard enough, right? Rooms that contain inhabitants, but no way for those inhabitants to get into the room. A lack of food, light, water, air sources, etc. Unless you can get buy-in in advance, unless you can get the players to say, okay, this kind of logic-free amusement park dungeon sounds like it might be fun, doesn't really offer much in the way of interest outside engaging with each room as a puzzle to be solved, which in and of itself is a fine experience. You just have to let them know that's what's going to happen. I think being a funhouse dungeon doesn't make something less a dungeon. It just makes it maybe a different kind of fun. There's content to be made here, like I said at the beginning, about all the different ways each dungeon-oriented system treats handling, building, and managing a dungeon, but that's more than a single question that office hours can handle. Still, it's a fascinating topic, so go do some research. See how other games handle that most important locale And I betcha you'll learn something cool. Because God knows that I have in all my time running in dungeons. So this has been episode number 62 of Office Hours, which is, of course, a call-in GM advice show. You can call in by visiting my website, www.adam-koble.com, clicking on the Office Hours link and filling out that form. But thank you for coming today, everybody. This has been another delightful episode. I'm going to think a little bit more on this dungeon stuff. I've been thinking about it since as soon as I saw that question. Dungeons. They're very important to our hobby, aren't they? Interesting stuff. Well, I hope today's episode has been helpful or useful or at the very least entertaining. And I hope that I will see you again next week for more. Thanks for coming, everybody. Have a good one.